Good morning. Welcome to another day of Bible study. We are in day 2 of the PartyOn Bible study. We are working through this book. You don't necessarily need this book, but if you would like to have this book, then you may get one by becoming a donor at christtable.today. We'll get one mailed out to you. If you are unaware of what we're doing at Christ's Table, then I would invite you to come and be a part with us for the journey of discovery of what church and faith and relationship with God is supposed to be like. You can sign up for our mailing list at christtable.today, and I would invite you to do that. Would love for you to become a part of what God is doing here. But today we find ourselves on day 2 of our look into the feasts and food and fellowship that goes on in the Bible, all of the fun. And I was amazed, as I said yesterday in our first Bible study, when I looked into this book and began to see all of the places where food and fun and joy and celebration were a part of it. I knew I had to do a Bible study on it. And in fact, the problem was I found so many passages that they wouldn't even fit in this study. And so there are more than I was able to accomplish getting into this study, which I think says something about God's heart for joy and celebration, and certainly says something about God's heart for food, which is near and dear to my heart. Now, today's passage on day 2 is a relatively easy passage. Many of you will have heard the part of this passage that comes after our reading today. And I've just got to say, because I was a little distraught by this, as I was looking up the passage, I saw what came before, and I really wish I had time today to handle what comes before our reading today. Now, you're all going to go and look at it, I'm certain. But what it is it's essentially Paul giving very specific instructions to the church in Corinth about women and head coverings and really how they conduct themselves in worship. And our modern day church has taken these things as being thus saith the Lord commands for today. And any elementary Bible student can discern that that's really not what's going on in this passage. And the people that have used it in a way to push down women or minorities or those things have completely not only missed the heart of God, they have completely and utterly misrepresented and misinterpreted this passage and what it's supposed to be. Now, that's not a part of our reading today, but if you're actually using a physical Bible, and I hope that you are, I didn't want you to be thrown off by that. And if you are, then let me know. We'll have a conversation. I'll send you somewhere to give you a little bit more background on what's going on there. But things are not as they might initially seem there. Paul isn't writing to your church. He's writing specifically to that church, which had a lot of problems. And those problems actually show up in this Bible study today. No food fights, please. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17. But in the following instructions, Paul says, I cannot praise you. And so he's writing to a church, and he's about to give them some instruction, and he's telling them, you're failing here. For it sounds as if more harm than good is done whenever you meet together. There are churches where I think this still may be true, that there is more harm than good done whenever you meet together. But we hope that that is never the case whenever we meet together as followers of God. And I guess we could say this too, just about our relationships, our friendships. There is a friend or two that I have that my wife sometimes nudges me about and says, when you get together with those people, actually more harm than good is done. And she points that out as a problem. And it is. If we're doing more harm whenever we're in relationship and community with someone else than we are good, then we need to take a real look at that. Whether it be a friend from high school or college, or whether that be other followers of Jesus Christ whom may not be followers of Jesus Christ if whenever we come together, more harm than good is being done. But this is what Paul is pointing out here in the meeting of the believers whenever they come together for worship. First, Paul says, I hear that there are divisions among you whenever you meet as a church. And Paul says, to some extent, I believe it, which is almost saying, I hear that there are things that are bad, and hearing them is one thing, but them actually being true is quite another. And I believe it on the basis of everything else that I'm hearing. But of course, obviously, there have to be some divisions among you so that you who don't have God's approval will be recognized. Paul's saying there are wolves in sheep clothing who are a part of religious communities. Maybe you've been turned off by a religious community because of somebody in that religious community. Maybe they weren't recognized as a wolf. Maybe they were there preying on other people rather than praying. They were there P-R-E-Y-ing rather than P-R-A-Y-ing, praying. There's a screen grab if you need one, rather than praying. And it caused you to be divided from the fellowship. And Paul says there really do need to be some divisions among you. You need to be able to recognize people who do not have God's approval, which means they're doing something by which God has removed his approval. And you need to handle that. And many people are turned off by religious places and religious people because they experience that and they have no tolerance for hypocrisy or that kind of thing. And you know what? God doesn't either. You're on the right side there. But Paul says in verse 20, whenever you meet together, you're not really interested in the Lord's Supper. And I kind of laughed about this yesterday. Who would be interested in the Lord's Supper? I mean, unless you're an uber religious person, the Lord's Supper is a small little piece of dry styrofoam type thing that I'm even hesitating calling bread. And depending on where you go, it's a little bit of grape juice or a sip of wine. Paul, why do you care whether or not we're interested in the Lord's Supper? I know that maybe the church has historically said it's important, but something being important doesn't necessarily mean I have to be interested in it, right? For some of you, hurry to eat your own meal without sharing with others. Wait, what? Let's go back to that previous slide. When you meet together, you're not really interested in the Lord's Supper. So, okay, now we have come up against a disconnect between our experience and the experience that the church was originally designed to experience. Whenever Paul here said in verse 20, you're not really interested in the Lord's Supper, we put it in our frame of reference for what the Lord's Supper is. 5 to 15 minutes as a part of worship, maybe every week if you're a Catholic, or in that vein of high church tradition, or maybe it's once a month or once a quarter if you're evangelical and trying to just be different than the Catholics in the high church. No matter what your rhythm is, your practice, though, is not the practice of the early church. And this is pointed out in 21, whenever he is speaking about the Lord's Supper, and he starts talking about a meal. Because worship wasn't pews and pulpits. I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating. Worship isn't and wasn't pews and pulpits. Worship was a meal. Not in grand cathedrals, not in grand worship spaces, but around the table that is sitting in your home and the tables that were sitting in their homes. And so literally the entire worship service, there's the air quotes, literally the entire worship service was a meal, was food and fellowship shared. Now, that is a worship service that I can get behind. That's a church that I can go to. I will trade my pews and pulpits for 200, Alex, and give me a potluck. Give me a potluck where I know the people who made the food. Give me that. Give me that as church. And I could be all about that. Now, maybe it's my Midwestern upbringing where everything circles and centers around food. But if that is you as a Midwesterner or wherever you are from, you're in good company because everything centers around food with God as well. And that is what we are learning in this study. And this is really important that we recognize this at the very beginning of the study, because we're going to talk a lot about worship and following God. And we're going to look at food. And you're going to think that I am crazy in moments of this Bible study where I'm pointing out the importance to God of food and fun and fellowship, because if you don't get this, then you're going to think, yeah, okay, it's important to you, but you're reading into this. I'm not. The early church worshiped around tables, around the plates of food. It was all the Lord's Supper. Now, they clearly read and understood that the bread and the cup, and they would go through that routine, which we still go through, but it was in the context of an entire meal, using the bread that they would have been eating around the table, using the cups that they would have been drinking around the table. And they did it for more than 3 centuries. What do you think about that? For longer than the United States has been in existence, worship happened in tables, in homes, with meals, and this was the Lord's Supper. It isn't until 350, 400 AD, 450 AD, where the pulpits begin to come in and the big cathedrals begin to come in, and the basilicas begin to come in, and where this communion or the Lord's Supper is relegated to just a few minutes in the service, but the rest of it is you're just sitting there like a student listening. It's not the way that it was. Paul says some of you hurry to eat your own meal without sharing with others. And he's talking about a real meal in the context of a worship service. And as a result, some go hungry while others get drunk. Paul says the way you're executing this meal is all wrong. What? Don't you have your own homes for eating and drinking? If you want to get sick from overeating, if you want to get drunk off your backside, do it in your own home. The meal that you're having with other followers of God is not the place for that. Are you really trying to disgrace God's church and shame the poor? Wait a minute, Paul. Did I miss a line? What do you mean by shame the poor, Paul? What does that mean? Paul says, what am I supposed to say? Like, am I supposed to approve this? Like any smart, normal person is going to understand that this is not okay. What you're doing, how you're handling this potluck meal, how you're handling this order of appetizer, entree, dessert, how you've organized this. It's not working. Now, the fact that he's brought up the poor is a good point, because it tells us that many different kinds of people were at these meals in these homes. Not just people who were like them. Whenever we throw a meal party, whenever we throw a dinner party, oftentimes whom we're inviting are people who are like us, people who are in our social class, people whom we get along with. We're trying to scratch the back of this person, maybe open a business door with that person, perhaps returning a favor with this other guy. The early church was a hodgepodge of mismatched people who all had one thing in common: Jesus Christ. When was the last time that you allowed a hodgepodge person to sit around your table? Jesus has a lot to say about the down and outers. Jesus has a lot to say about the fringe folks. Jesus has a lot to say about those who are on the margins. Jesus has a lot to say about the under-resourced and undervalued. In fact, what he says is you resource them and you value them. And is there a better way to value someone than inviting them into your home to sit around your table to talk about faith? You say, well, I value them because I support a missionary. I value them because I give to this community organization that does good. I sponsor a child. I serve volunteer hours in the local community organization that helps those people. When was the last time they were around your table in your home? What am I supposed to say? Paul says, you've completely misunderstood and are now misrepresenting the heart of God. Do you want me to praise you? I'm certainly not going to praise you for this. You see, what was going on there is they were sitting in cliques, in groups. The people who were on one level sat in one place, the people who were on another level sat in another place, and the people who were on no level, who hadn't even hit the first rung of the ladder, were in a different place. And so they had coordinated themselves off in cliques. People would bring food. The rich people would bring really good food and really good drink, and they would consume it themselves without sharing, leaving other people who were in the same worship service meal hungry. Well, they went home drunk, and they went home hungry. Paul says, you want me to praise you for this? This isn't God's church. Open your home to people. When you open your home to people, open your heart. I'm not going to praise you for this. If you think I'm going to praise you for the way you're continuing on in worship in here, you're wrong. I think Paul would be saying the same thing to us in this time period for the same reason. You think I'm going to praise you for your worship services? You think I'm going to praise you for the way that you treat other people? You think I'm going to praise you for the buildings that you build? You think I'm going to praise you for the robes that you wear? You think I'm going to praise you for inviting other people from the country club to sit at your pew with you? You think I'm going to praise you for this? Are you insane? Have you completely misunderstood the heart of God? Invite people unlike you into your homes and share the best with them. Boy, I learned that in reading Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club back in high school. Share the best with them. This church, Paul says, I'm not going to praise you. This is a food fight that you should not win. It's time for you in your celebrations and worship to treat people equally. And maybe for us, the way to begin to treat people equally is to begin to actually change how we worship, to being around tables, having conversations with those who are unlike us, who are different than us, so that we can learn, so that we can understand, so that we can grow. Because for me, nothing really changes without a conversation, without getting to know someone. And so I think I've already made way too many points in this, but before I go, I want to say this. Paul says, if you aren't going to express your life together by mixing and sharing, you might as well stay home. This was Paul's thing. Whenever you come together, all the food comes together, all the drink comes together, everybody shares. It is an equal playing field. So many people have walked away from their faith, which they've not really walked away from their faith. They've just walked away from church and church people, because it wasn't an even playing field. It was just like any other club or organization or hierarchy in the world. Go back to Acts chapter 2 and read verses 42 through 47 again and see what God's world was like. I read a lot about Marxism and communism and socialism on the internet these days, where people fighting over politics. But you know what? The early church looked a lot more like that than it does most of what we've experienced. It says they sold their possessions and they brought them together and they evened it out among each other and gave it to the poor. And this is what Paul is really saying here. Paul is saying, you know what? If you're not going to mix and share what God has given you, if you're not going to reduce what you have in order to give someone else something that they don't have and that they need, just stay home. It's not the model today. The model today is everybody in church, no matter what. Everybody come together. Why? Because it's about a number. It's not about a lifestyle as much. Same thing was happening there almost 2,000 years ago. The problems are still the same, but you and I believe, can fix them. Let's fix them. Until tomorrow.